He leaned across my desk with that smug, untouchable look and said, "You're fired. Effective immediately." And just like that, 5 years of loyalty, late nights, and sacrifice meant nothing. My name is Samantha Pierce, 29 years old, and I had spent the last half-decade building my career as the operations manager at Titan Core Solutions, a high-profile tech firm that promised innovation, integrity, and growth on its glossy brochures, but delivered something else entirely behind closed doors. The man who just fired me, Gregory Hunt, 42, was my boss, the so-called visionary who built the company's image but thrived on intimidation and control. Gregory and I had a history that was complicated, frustrating, and, until that moment, professional. I had respected him, even trusted him, for most of my tenure. He had mentored me early in my career, guided me through presentations, and subtly encouraged my ambition. But over the past year, something had shifted. His guidance had turned into scrutiny, his mentorship into micromanagement, and his casual smiles into thinly veiled sneers. I froze, my brain trying to reconcile the absurdity of the situation. Fired. Me. Just like that. My instincts screamed at me that this was personal, that his sudden anger, his tight jaw and cold eyes, hid something deeper. Yet a small, stubborn part of me refused to believe it. There must be a reason, I thought. Maybe it's a mistake. Maybe it's temporary. But deep down, I already knew. It was never about mistakes or temporary lapses. Gregory had always had a way of wielding his authority like a weapon, and somewhere along the line, I had become inconvenient. I gathered my things in silence, each movement deliberate, careful not to show the mix of fury and panic boiling inside me. He didn't bother to look at me. His eyes were fixed on the spreadsheet in front of him, like firing me was just another line item in a budget he'd already decided to cut. As I walked down the glass-paneled corridors of Titan Core, the office buzzing with oblivious colleagues, my mind raced. How had it come to this? The meetings where he had complimented my work, the projects we had celebrated together, had all of it been a setup? Had I been too naive to see the subtle undermining, the casual undermining comments in team calls, the way he shifted credit away from me just enough to keep me on edge? And yet, even as my heart hammered with indignation, a part of me couldn't shake the eerie calm that followed. It was that tiny, cold, uncomfortable certainty, the whisper of intuition I'd learned to trust after years in the corporate jungle, that something about this firing wasn't as simple as it seemed. I remembered the first time he had suggested a promotion discussion a year ago. Back then, it had been flattering. Now, I realized, it might have been the first thread of the trap he had been weaving, subtle, deliberate, designed to position me where I would be most vulnerable. By the time I reached the elevator, my chest tightened not just with anger, but with a slow-burn curiosity that I couldn't suppress. My mind, furious yet calculating, began spinning through possibilities. How could I turn this humiliation into leverage? Could I somehow, in some way, flip this script? I stepped out onto the street, sunlight hitting my face, and forced myself to inhale, to keep calm. People passed by, oblivious to the storm raging inside me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. In fact, if my intuition was right, it was only just beginning. As I hailed a cab to clear my head, I caught myself thinking, almost quietly, this isn't just about losing a job, it's about rewriting the rules. And somewhere deep in my gut, I knew that Gregory Hunt had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The next morning, I found myself staring at my phone long after the alarm went off. I was still technically unemployed, at least, that's what Gregory had said, but the thought of returning to Titan Core in any capacity gnawed at me. Something inside me refused to accept that this was the end. And yet, even as I sipped coffee and tried to steady my racing thoughts, I couldn't shake the feeling that the world I'd trusted for 5 years had quietly started shifting beneath my feet. I decided to go back, not for the job, not yet, but to observe. I needed clarity, confirmation of the uneasy whisper that had settled in my chest. When I walked through the sliding glass doors of Titan Core, the office felt different. Cooler. Tense. Like the air itself was holding a secret. Gregory's office door was closed, a deliberate choice I noted immediately. Usually, he left it open, inviting interruptions, giving the illusion of approachability. Today, it was a fortress. And when I caught a glimpse of him on the security monitor, speaking sharply with someone I didn't recognize, a chill ran down my spine. Their gestures were quick, almost frantic, and there was a tension in his posture that I'd never seen before. It didn't take long for the first red flags to appear. On the floor, colleagues whispered behind closed doors, glancing nervously toward his office. One of my teammates, Elena, looked at me with wide, cautious eyes, as if she'd discovered a dangerous truth she wasn't supposed to share. Her tone was clipped when she said, "Samantha, I don't think you're supposed to be back here yet." "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but my heart was hammering. She hesitated. "I don't know. It's complicated. Just watch yourself." Her words, vague as they were, set off a storm in my mind. Complicated? Watch myself? Every instinct I had screamed that something was off, and I couldn't tell if it was about me, about Gregory, or the entire company. Later, I observed him in a meeting with the leadership team. He was charming, persuasive, his usual confident self, but there were subtle cracks in the armor. He interrupted team members in a way that seemed innocent on the surface, yet I noticed the dismissive flicks of his eyes, the faint smirks that quickly vanished when someone looked at him. He seemed to favor certain voices, nodding encouragingly to a few while subtly undermining others. I knew this game all too well, sowing seeds of loyalty while quietly pushing people into self-doubt. I felt it then, the uneasy clash of my instincts against my memories of past trust. Part of me wanted to rationalize it. Maybe it's just stress. Maybe he's under pressure. But another part, the sharper, survival-driven part, whispered, "No. This is deliberate." As the day dragged on, I noticed more oddities. Files were missing from shared drives. Reports I had worked on were suddenly attributed to someone else. Emails had been altered, details subtly changed. I felt a twist of betrayal, but at the same time, I questioned my perception. Was I imagining things? Was this paranoia? My rational mind and my gut were fighting, and that internal tension left me exhausted. By afternoon, I finally cornered myself in an empty conference room. I leaned against the cool glass wall, closing my eyes. 5 years of loyalty, of sleepless nights and dedication, felt suddenly fragile. Every memory of encouragement from Gregory now had a shadow over it. Every compliment, every nod, every meeting replayed in my mind with new, suspicious eyes. And yet, there was a strange, inexplicable pull to him, a twisted magnetism that made it impossible to fully detach. He was dangerous, yes, but he was also brilliant at manipulation. The very traits that had made me admire him before were now the ones that made me question everything. I left the office that evening with more questions than answers. My intuition screamed that Gregory's firing of me wasn't just a whim, it was strategic, personal, calculated. But my rational side whispered doubts. Maybe I'm reading too much into it. Maybe I misjudged him all along. As I walked through the city streets, I realized the emotional strain was growing unbearable. Trust had turned into suspicion, admiration into wariness, and confidence into self-doubt. My mind, once sharp and decisive, now felt clouded by conflicting signals. And still, somewhere beneath the fatigue, beneath the confusion and hurt, a single thought persisted. If Gregory thinks he's won, he's gravely mistaken. Little did I know then that the first red flags I had seen were only the surface, tiny ripples on a sea that was about to erupt. I hadn't expected it. Not like this. It started with a casual Friday email, one that seemed innocent enough, a budget update sent to the leadership team. I opened it while sitting in my small apartment, the city lights flickering through my window. And then I saw it. My name, carefully erased from a project I had poured months into. Months of strategy, meetings, late nights, sleepless weekends, gone. Replaced by someone else. Someone handpicked by Gregory. And worse, the report contained subtle changes, numbers skewed just enough to make my work look sloppy, as though I had been incompetent all along. I stared at the screen, disbelief rooting me to my chair. My mind spun. I thought of every meeting where he praised me, every word of encouragement, every nod of approval. All lies. Every single one. He hadn't fired me because I was unworthy or failing. He had orchestrated my downfall, manipulating facts, colleagues, and perceptions to make it seem like I had failed, so he could take control. And it wasn't just my career on the line. As I dug deeper, checking internal communications I still had access to, I discovered emails between Gregory and a rival firm, our fiercest competitor, discussing confidential strategies I had developed. They weren't just exploiting my work, they were profiting from it, and the entire scheme had been built to look like I had mismanaged it. I felt my stomach twist, bow rising. My hands shook, and my chest felt tight as though my heart had been replaced with lead. How had I not seen this? How had I missed all the subtle manipulations, the favoritism, the little dismissals? Had I been blind all along? My mind raced through the past year, replaying every interaction with Gregory, the compliments that were actually setups, the mentorship that was actually monitoring, the smiles that masked scheming. Tears prickled my eyes, not loud, not dramatic, but a slow, burning betrayal that made my body tense. Shock, pain, disbelief, and somewhere in the back of my mind, a faint pang of guilt. I should have seen it. I should have known better. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at the screen, letting the waves of realization wash over me. The quiet hum of the city outside my window was deafening in contrast to the storm inside. I felt hollow, yet fiercely alive, like the very core of my being had been tested and stripped bare. And then came the anger, not the fiery, explosive kind that screams and breaks things, but a slow, deliberate heat that spread from my chest, coiling like a serpent ready to strike. A calm before the storm. I knew then that this wasn't about revenge yet. It was about preparation, observation, patience, strategy. Gregory had underestimated me. He had assumed that fear or confusion would keep me down, that the humiliation of being fired would paralyze me. But the truth was, his betrayal had done something he couldn't anticipate. It had sharpened me. Every sleepless night, every pang of doubt, every fleeting moment of guilt had prepared me for this. I thought about the title of my own story before I even realized it. He tried to fire me, and yet here I was, wide awake in the dark, seeing clearly for the first time who he really was. Not a mentor, not a visionary, not a leader, but a schemer, a manipulator, a man who believed power could be taken with lies and intimidation. And yet I did not rage. I did not call him. I did not tell anyone what I had uncovered, not yet. I simply let the knowledge sink in, letting it fuel a quiet, deadly determination. Because if Gregory thought he had won, he had no idea what was coming. I closed my laptop and leaned back against the couch, the apartment silent except for the soft hum of the city. I allowed myself a moment of stillness, feeling the simmering anger beneath the surface, controlled, precise. I let my mind wander through possibilities, plans, contingencies. I had been betrayed. Deeply, personally, professionally. But that betrayal, that cruel, calculated deception, had lit a fire inside me that nothing could extinguish. And when the storm came, it wouldn't just rain, it would drown him. I sat in my apartment for hours, staring at the city lights through the rain-speckled window, feeling simultaneously small and colossal. The betrayal had cut deep, deeper than any dismissal or insult ever could. Gregory's manipulation, his scheming, the way he had erased my contributions, it wasn't just professional sabotage. It was personal. For a long time, I let myself sink into the familiar pit of self-pity. Questions swirled endlessly in my mind. Why didn't I see it? Was I naive? Was I weak? The more I replayed the last year, the more my body ached, not from physical exhaustion, but from the emotional weight of realizing I had trusted the wrong person completely. Then, in the quiet darkness of my apartment, a raw thought emerged, a painful, beautiful truth. No one was coming to save me. No mentor, no colleague, no company policy, no magical plot twist. If I wanted justice, if I wanted vindication, if I wanted to reclaim what was mine, I would have to do it myself. The realization struck like lightning, painful but electrifying. It didn't make the betrayal any less cruel, it made it fuel. My grief began to morph, slowly, almost imperceptibly, into something stronger, determination. Quiet. Precise. fierce. I thought about all the ways Gregory had underestimated me. He thought my dedication made me obedient. He thought my trust made me weak. He thought my humility kept me from challenging him. But he had forgotten one thing. I was relentless. I had worked in this corporate battlefield long enough to know every play, every weakness, every hidden corner of this empire he thought he controlled. I started listing everything I had lost: reputation, authority, time, pride. But alongside the loss, I cataloged my assets: knowledge, experience, industry contacts, and, most importantly, my mind. My mind had always been my sharpest weapon, and it hadn't dulled with betrayal. By the next morning, I had a plan, not a fully formed scheme, but a mindset. I would watch, I would wait, and I would strike. Not recklessly. Not in anger. Strategically. Calmly. Methodically. I pulled out a notebook I hadn't used in months, its pages empty but waiting, and began to write. I mapped out the network Gregory relied on, the projects he bragged about as his own, the people who whispered in his ear. I revisited every project I had worked on, noting where the cracks had been exploited. I started imagining ways to reclaim control, not violently, not impulsively, but intelligently. For the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of excitement, a pulse of power. The betrayal, the manipulation, the lies, they hadn't broken me. They had refined me. I was no longer the naive, loyal employee who had trusted a wolf in a suit. I was someone different now, someone who understood that pain could be weaponized, that awareness could be turned into strategy, and that patience was the truest form of power. I paused in the notebook, pen hovering over the paper, and let myself breathe. The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but it was no longer blind. It was controlled, calculated, ready. I thought about the title of my story again. He tried to fire me, I ended up hiring him, and I smiled quietly to myself. The road ahead was not going to be easy. I would have to play the long game, think 3 steps ahead, and never reveal the fire burning beneath my calm exterior. But I was ready. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming my life, my confidence, my agency. Every insult, every slight, every betrayal had been a lesson disguised as pain. And now I was awake, alert, and alive in a way I hadn't been before. As I closed the notebook and stood by the window, watching the sun rise over the skyline, I whispered to myself, I don't need anyone to save me. I am enough. I am ready. The storm inside me had transformed into a quiet, unshakable force. And soon, Gregory Hunt would learn that underestimating me had been his first and gravest mistake. I built my plan like a surgeon assembling instruments, quietly, precisely, with cold hands and a warm, steady heart. Revenge isn't fireworks and shouting, it's patience, documentation, and the slow dismantling of a carefully constructed lie. Gregory had assumed I was shattered. He'd assumed humiliation would keep me silent. That was his miscalculation. He forgot that the person he broke was the one who knew his blueprint best. First, evidence. I reclaimed access to what I still could: old cloud backups, archived meeting notes, and drafts with timestamps that proved authorship. I reached out to a few trusted industry contacts under the pretense of casual coffee, asking innocuous questions about collaborations and joint ventures. Those conversations were soft probes, enough to remind people of timelines, to nudge memories toward the truth without revealing my hand. People remember differently when you give them a gentle nudge. I copied emails that had been altered, saved versions with metadata that couldn't be faked, and downloaded the raw attachments that showed my original work. Each file I saved felt like a small victory. Each timestamp was a nail in the coffin of his story. I organized everything in a secure folder, labeled by date and project, methodical enough to satisfy any legal team and emotional enough to feed my resolve. Second, witnesses. I didn't need everyone to know the whole story, I just needed a few who would back me up when it mattered. Elena, despite her fear, had been my first ally. Over a nervous lunch, I let her see my evidence, not in a dramatic reveal, but as a quiet, deliberate sharing. I watched her face shift from apprehension to recognition, then to anger. "You were right," she whispered, fingers gripping the coffee cup. I saw some of those emails and thought I was imagining it. Her voice trembled, but it held. That was all I needed. A witness with courage enough to corroborate under pressure. I set emotional traps designed not to humiliate but to expose. Gregory loved performance, public praise, private boasting. He'd built a small court of sycophants who mirrored his power. I began feeding that court the illusion that I was done, a broken asset he had discarded. I let them see me step back publicly, posting neutral updates, doing the quiet, moving on routine that made people comfortable with his narrative. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, I seeded small truths in conversations, a mention of an unreleased strategy, a hint about a meeting he'd had, things I knew would make the right people curious enough to dig. I also used emotion as leverage. People underestimate the power of a sincere apology or a regretful tone in private messages. I wrote one such message to a junior analyst who had once been eager to impress Gregory. I didn't ask for loyalty. I asked for honesty. I sent him a draft of an early report that bore my edits and asked, casually, "Do you remember reviewing this?" He replied without thinking, "Yes, I remember Samantha's notes were the backbone." Small validations repeated built a lattice of corroboration I could lean on. Third, pressure points. Gregory's reputation wasn't just his ego, it was fragile. He depended on public validation, investor trust, and a few high-profile clients who liked the company's face, not its skeleton. I mapped those vulnerabilities. I found the client meetings where his name was the headline and the moments where his confidence would tip into arrogance. I started planting seeds of doubt in those circles, neutrally, conversationally, through industry contacts who respected my work. Funny, I'd say to an old client over coffee, "I remember that plan being a collaboration." It's odd when timelines shift on public briefs. A shrug here, a puzzled frown there, ripples became murmurs. Every move was emotionally charged because every move reminded me of what I had lost. But I never let anger dictate tactics. I was cold, but my cold was steely, the kind that focuses, never overreaches. The more I worked, the more confident I became. I watched Gregory from a distance, at conferences, through LinkedIn activity, and via industry chatter. He strutted as if untouched, posting victory photos and thanking his team for their hard work. To the world, he stayed the unflappable leader. To me, he was a pageant performer whose props were about to fall. There were moments I doubted myself, late nights when the evidence felt insufficient, when the weight of the plan pressed on my chest. But then I'd look at the files, at Elena's determined face, at the timestamps that didn't lie, and the doubt would evaporate. This wasn't petty revenge anymore, it was reclamation. I wasn't out to destroy him for the sake of cruelty. I was out to restore the truth that had been stolen from me. As my small network tightened and my dossier thickened, I felt the equilibrium shift. The quiet that had followed my firing began to crack with tiny, strategic sounds, a question in a boardroom, an investor asking for clarifications, a client emailing for details they'd never requested before. Gregory still believed he'd broken me. He still believed his narrative held. That arrogance would be his undoing. I closed my laptop that night with my folder encrypted and my heart steady. Every decision from here would be a chess move, not one of brute force, but of precision. I had set the board. I had the pieces. And the next time we met, it wouldn't be as an employee confronting a boss. It would be as a woman who understood exactly how to hire him back on her terms. When the day came, it moved like a scene from a film, slow, composed, every detail arranged so that the silence before the strike felt almost holy. I had rehearsed the moment 100 times in my head, but nothing could have prepared me for the way the room sharpened into a single point of focus. Gregory. The boardroom at Titan Core was all glass and planted ferns, a theater polished for power. Gregory stood at the head of the table, smiling like a man who'd already written the epilogue. Investors were present, a few key clients on a conference call, and the executive team sat like chess pieces in his service. He began with the practiced confidence of a man who'd convinced himself of his own myth. "We've had a phenomenal quarter," he said, voice smooth, fingers steepled. Cameras from the financial press were live at the window, perfect optics, perfect control. Except the optics were about to change. I entered like anyone else, removed from the scene, because the plan had never been about spectacle. It was about proof. Elena sat beside me steady. The junior analyst whose conscience I'd nudged was online from another city, his screen a small rectangle in the room. I carried nothing dramatic, a laptop, a sealed folder, and the kind of quiet I reserved for surgical strikes. When Gregory finished his opening flourish, I asked for the floor. There was a ripple of confusion. He frowned, surprised, then amused. "Samantha," he said, the name a small weapon. "You're not on the agenda." "No," I said, and my voice was calm enough to be mistaken for courtesy. "But some people in this room are about to find out how much of what they applaud is borrowed." I connected my laptop to the main screen. The first slide was simple: file names, dates, and unalterable metadata timestamps that showed drafts and revisions long before Gregory had ever claimed ownership. The room buzzed. I let the silence stretch, watching his face as color drained and composure wavered. Then I played the emails. Not edited excerpts, but whole threads, raw, authentic, and damning. There were lines between Gregory and a known competitor's VP discussing transfer details, specific strategy points that matched my original plans word for word. The language was clinical, the culpability undeniable. Elena corroborated each point, identifying meeting times she'd sat in on. The junior analyst confirmed that the draft I'd shown him weeks ago contained my annotations and tracked changes, annotations now mirrored in the competitor's public deck. Gregory's smile faltered. He interjected, tried to spin, to charm the panic into amusement. "Context," he said. "There's context." But the room had context now: evidence, witnesses, and the one thing his arrogance hadn't anticipated: an audience that could verify for themselves. On the live call, a major client whose logo adorned Titan Core's website unmuted and asked for clarification about duplicated material in a public brief. A hedge fund quietly signaled through their counsel that they were freezing discretionary funding pending investigation. The press leaned in, sensing the unravel. Someone in the back of the room opened a private chat and pasted the competitor email into the message thread. The sound of typing felt louder than any shout. He tried to fight denials, stammers, the flailing maneuvers of a man accustomed to controlling narratives. But I walked through the facts methodically, like a prosecutor, letting each fresh, irrefutable piece of proof land with clinical precision: timestamps, corroborating witnesses, internal version histories, and contractual overlaps with the rival firm. Each item was a scalpel, each cut exposed more of the rot beneath his suit. Then came the silence. The cameras caught it, the private moment when a man realizes the applause was a facade. Investors exchanged glances. The board chair closed his laptop and asked that legal counsel convene immediately. Phones buzzed with messages from partners asking for emergency calls. A key client quietly disconnected the line with a single formal sentence: "We must review our relationship." Gregory's face crumpled in a way I'd never seen. He reached, half pleading, for charm, then for threats, then for explanations that sounded thinner with every breath. He had no solid ground left to stand on. I did not clap. I did not raise my voice. I closed my laptop with deliberate calm, the soft click louder than his protests. I let the room handle the aftermath, the investigations, the legal teams, the reputational hemorrhage. My part was done. The truth moves slowly, but when it lands hard. As people filed out, whispers followed like a slow tidal pull: embezzlement, breach of contract, collusion. The press outside had already begun drafting their lead paragraphs. The investors made private calls. The board chair asked Gregory to step out while counsel reviewed the evidence. He stumbled toward the door like a man unmoored, his earlier swagger replaced by a hollow, urgent pleading. I stood by the window, city light painting silver across the glass, and watched him go. My hands were steady. My chest was quiet. The anger that had once roared was now something cooler, a sharpened instrument. The betrayal had been met with proof. The humiliation had been met with truth. In the elevator, a junior assistant, someone I barely knew, looked at me and whispered, "Thank you." It was small, sincere, the kind of gratitude that needs no stage. I nodded. Outside, The evening pressed in, lights blinking like distant witnesses. I walked away from the building not as a casualty, but as a woman who'd reclaimed her story with calm precision. The storm had hit, and the wreckage at its center was plainly visible. But even as the fallout began, lawsuits, resignations, headlines, I felt no glee. Only a clear, unshakable quiet. The hardest part was over. The last act, the part where I decided what to do with a man who'd tried to erase me, was still mine to write. The days after the boardroom reveal were quiet in a way that felt almost sacred. The chaos that had followed Gregory's unraveling was spectacular from a distance, but I never needed to watch it closely. Investors pulled back, clients requested audits, and whispers of lawsuits spread like wildfire. Gregory Hunt, the man who once wielded authority like a weapon, was reduced to a cautionary tale whispered behind closed doors. The empire he had built on manipulation and deceit had crumbled quietly but decisively, leaving him to navigate the wreckage alone. I, meanwhile, moved through the world differently. The relief wasn't loud. It wasn't a party or a trophy. It was a quiet knowing, the kind that settles into your bones when you've walked through fire and emerged unscathed. I returned to work, not Titan Core, not under his shadow, but to projects where my voice mattered and my contributions could shine without distortion. My reputation, once threatened, was restored by the undeniable proof of my skill, my foresight, and my resilience. I spent mornings reflecting on what the entire ordeal had taught me. Strength is not about retaliation in the moment. It's about patience and clarity. Trust is not blind. It's discerning, built slowly, and earned by those who show integrity when no one is watching. Self-worth is not dependent on recognition from others, but on the quiet confidence of knowing what you've built with your own hands. There were moments of stillness where I allowed myself to feel the sting of betrayal, not to wallow, but to honor it. Pain, I realized, is not the enemy. It's a guide, a signal that something needs attention, that injustice exists, and that awareness can be transformed into action. I had let it teach me, not break me. People asked me about Gregory afterward. Some wanted details, some wanted drama. I told them only what mattered. The truth always surfaces. Lies, manipulation, and betrayal are powerful only if left unchecked. I had learned the hard way that forgiveness is optional, but vigilance is necessary. And when you reclaim your power, you don't just survive, you flourish. Walking through the streets one evening, I felt the city hum beneath my feet like a pulse in tune with mine. Neon lights shimmered on wet pavement, reflecting in puddles like fleeting truths shimmering before settling. I smiled quietly, because I knew the poetic justice of it all. The man who tried to erase me had, in the end, become a footnote in the story he never controlled, while I wrote my own narrative in bold, undeniable strokes. I paused by a cafe window, watching the world move, people laughing, cars passing, life continuing in beautiful chaos. And I realized, freedom isn't just about removing someone toxic from your life. It's about reclaiming your energy, your dignity, and your choices. The lesson was simple, yet profound. Betrayal can break the heart, but it cannot touch the soul that refuses to yield. So, to anyone watching this, have you ever been betrayed by a friend, a colleague, or someone you trusted deeply? How did you respond? Did you let it define you, or did you rise above? I want to hear your story. Share it in the comments below, because your experience matters. And if you want to see more stories about resilience, power, and reclaiming your life, don't forget to subscribe. And as for Gregory, the world learned what I already knew. You can try to silence a fire, but a fire that burns with truth and determination cannot be extinguished. Because some people will try to bury you, erase your name, and rewrite your story. But remember this, the pen is always in your hands, and sometimes the person you fire last is yourself rising first.